Ah, well, now I remember. The Wellbeing Show. I do it so many times, it goes in and out of my head. I'm your host, Noel McDermott, and tonight we've got a great guest, Annie McCullough, who's joining us from Canada, of all places, I believe. You're over there in Canada, yeah, on the West Coast in Vancouver.
Oh, yeah.
Which is great. She's just stuffed her lunch down her throat, so I'm hoping that she doesn't get indigestion, having to sort of force it down too much. Just before I jump into the show and we start talking to Annie, just to let you know, it is live. It'd be great to have you join us with your comments. We're streaming on several platforms as usual. So Facebook Live, on YouTube Live, and on Periscope. I still don't know how Periscope works. I have no idea. I've got this very clever team that do this stuff for me, but I can't find it. So some of you may have found it, but that'd be great if you have, to drop us some comments in and let us know what you think, or some questions that you may have for Annie. None for me, because I'm too boring, so you see me every week, so don't bother. Or you can give me a call on my number, which is 07506 319 745. That's +44 if you're calling from outside the UK. So +44 7506 319 745. You can come through on WhatsApp to avoid the carrier charges if you like. It'd be great to hear from you. Enough of that now. On to the really important stuff. Hello, Annie.
Hi, Noel.
How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. I thought I better warn you, as well as our guests, that we're not alone here.
Ah.
My emotional support dog, Frankie, is sitting beside me here.
Hey.
He does like to snore. That's him right now. So if anybody hears that, just please be aware that it's not Noel. He hasn't fallen asleep. Neither have I. And Frankie's just wanting to make his presence known.
But it's quite normal for me. I have people falling asleep on me all the time, Annie. It's fine. So there you go. It's nothing new. I'm sure I'll have you asleep soon as well. You can snore away with your dog. And we can talk about that, having an emotional support dog, because I know that you have it for a very specific reason. And you're described as an international DJ and recovery advocate. So we'll come to that, what all that means in a short while. Tell us how it's been going for you during the pandemic up there in Canada, in Vancouver. How have you been experiencing it? How's it been going for you personally, and also within your country as well? Just sort of bring us into that a little bit.
So I think we're very fortunate here on the West Coast. The first wave didn't hit here very hard. We had very low numbers and very minimal. We did go into lockdown, into quarantine for a few months with all businesses shut down, but we've been open again probably since about May. And we're in restrictions again right now, but not in lockdown. Businesses are still open currently. Schools are still open, etc. Other parts of Canada were not so lucky. A couple of the other provinces had quite high numbers and longer lockdowns and are in further restrictions than we are here in Vancouver. So that's what it's been like in Canada. And I think we've been very fortunate. Our government has supported people like myself who were not able to work during the pandemic. We were lucky to be supported financially, much generously than what I've heard from our counterparts to the south in the US, for instance. So grateful for that. And myself personally, I was in the UK actually when the borders were about to close. So I flew out of Heathrow on March 13th, literally the day when the US was about to shut their borders. Canada never shut their borders exactly. They shut them between Canada and the US, but they, I would have been able to get home. But it was quite an, very crisis, very, dramatic, kind of everyone trying to leave, right? The airport was insane. And of course, no one was wearing masks at that time. I think back to that last time I was on an airplane and just, how, incredibly lucky I was not to have been exposed, because I had just been in Rome, in Milan, and in Switzerland, and in London. So in 4 places, well, not so much Switzerland, but some of those other places were definitely ended up being hotspots. So
yeah.
I'm very, very lucky, very lucky. And so my life has changed dramatically because of the pandemic. I haven't been anywhere outside of Vancouver, really, other than just over to the island here. And I'll get to that in a minute. But my life as a recovery coach, and the DJ part is, it's funny that I don't know where that came from, but that's my former life, and we can talk about that when I tell you my story.
That's why you're a recovery coach, is the DJ part.
Exactly, is because I used to be a DJ.
That's right. I'm sure we'll come to that. Yeah,
you're on to me. So yeah, life was definitely impacted here. Now I was fortunate. I own a home here, and I was able to rent out the bigger part of the house to a family, and I moved into the basement in January, which was just a fluke, because I thought, I'm going to be traveling a lot this year. I don't need to be here. I don't need a big footprint here. I'll rent out the main part of the house and just be in this little small space. Well, that little small space became a bit of a prison. I'm not going to lie to you. I spent 5 months in there. And not that the space itself isn't lovely, but there was a family of 5 living above me, and it became quite, untenable, truly. But I had no choice. I had to put up with it. And again, not to jump into my story too much, but I have PTSD. It's why I have Frankie. And my PTSD has to do with loud, sudden noises, because of I was a witness to a murder at an after hours nightclub, part of my DJ story. And to be underneath a family with 3 young children, the sudden loud noises are frequent, especially when no one can leave the house for 5 months. So it definitely accelerated things with my symptoms, and in a good way forced me to do some more treatment around my PTSD. So it does have a silver lining, the story, but the pandemic certainly had a financial impact, an emotional impact, a physical, obviously, quarantine impact. So yeah, it's been quite the year. It's been quite the year.
Sounds really tough, actually, Annie. Sounds like it's been really tough for you, to be honest. And sort of, I really feel for you, sort of being in that sort of claustrophobic space. And it was interesting. I mean, there was a lot talked about in terms of people going to be isolated by the pandemic, but my sense was not so much that. We were going to get quite claustrophobic. We were going to be on top of each other, and that would be the sense, because we have this ability to move around and do things. And I think you're confirming it for me that that was certainly your experience in terms of sort of that sort of things encroaching in. I mean, you've mentioned your story, as it were, a few times. So shall we go back in time and tell us about sort of Annie McCullough? That's a good Irish name or good Scottish name somewhere. Which one is it? Irish?
Well, I have the Irish spelling of a Scottish name, so it's McCullough, Ough, but I'm an MC. So so you've nailed it. I'm 100% Irish. Well, I'll tell you, I'm adopted. So McCullough is actually not my true birth name, but I was born to my 17-year-old mother, when she gave birth to me, was an Irish Catholic, and I was adopted into an Irish Catholic family. So you see, you can't escape your destiny, no matter how hard you try. So you want me to just tell you?
Yeah, tell us. So you were born in Canada?
In Canada, in Toronto, the biggest city in Canada, and grew up there until I was 23, and then I moved out west when I was 23. So I've spent about half my life on each of the well, they call Toronto the East Coast, but it's not. It's in the middle. So it's kind of funny that people say the East Coast, but it's not. It's in the middle. So I was, like I said, I was adopted, raised by 2 really wonderful but alcoholic parents. My dad was a binge drinker. He would try to get sober. He was really lovely, wonderful man with a great sense of humor. And I loved him, and I was absolutely daddy's little girl. And sadly, he died when I was 11 under what is, we know this now, of course. It was alcoholism is what it should have said on the death certificate. What it did say was death by misadventure. So whether he did it on purpose, intentionally to die or not, is not really clear. But I believe alcoholism, one way or the other, is what ultimately caused his death. And I was an only child. I was very precocious, very curious, very intelligent, did really well in school, played in the band, played sports. Mostly my life was good, if you will, in terms of that stuff. My mom was a nurse. My parents met in Montreal. She was from Newfoundland originally, good Irish Catholic drinkers, and she was very busy when my dad was alive, making sure that she was keeping things together for him. But once he passed away, her drinking really accelerated. So I didn't really get parented. I do definitely feel a lot like I raised myself. And that's okay. I had a lot of angels in my life that came around, babysitters, family friends, different people who made sure that I was taken care of even when things were not so great. And then I got to high school and I'd had a bit of a hard time. Some bullying had happened in elementary school. And I remember making a conscious decision that I was absolutely, under any circumstances, not going to have the problems I had in elementary school. And I would do whatever it took to fit in. And so that looked like drinking, smoking, doing drugs, and, my wonderful straight A, gifted program, all this stuff, I barely graduated high school. So that was, it was fun. It was a lot of fun. And I had no idea what alcoholism was. I had no idea that I was drinking in any way, shape, or form, any way that was not normal, because no one had ever talked about alcoholism. No one had ever talked about my dad's disease, his death. There was no grief counseling. There was no discussion, nothing.
It's interesting. I was thinking about, it's a very familiar story, this idea of these angel-like adults that know what's going on. They know exactly what's going on, and they come in and they do that reparative parenting role. They still don't change things, though, do they? It's sort of, they still leave you in that situation. But it seemed perfectly normal, doesn't it, to you at that time? That
everything's normal. There's nothing to compare it to, really. There's television shows and stuff, but other than that, what does it say in the big book? Something about the alcoholic life is the only one we know. I didn't know any different. Not the parenting and not my own life. It really did seem normal.
And you're clearly not resentful about your parents. You sort of got over whatever you had about them a long time ago, by the looks of it, and sort of, obviously they did the best they could. It wasn't great, but it was the best they could do. So there you go.
I used to say that literal statement. They did the best that they could with the tools that they had. Especially about my mom. I was quite angry with her for a long time.
Were you?
I definitely, we had a very strained relationship for about 20 years. It's better now. She's 87. She still lives in Newfoundland. We live on opposite ends, and I think that probably serves us quite well. I miss her, though. I haven't seen her in almost 2 years. I was supposed to go in March when I got back from the UK, and it didn't happen. Of course, now I still can't go there. It's the only province where they won't let anybody in. They're so guarded about what they have there, and good for them, because they've had 20 cases and they don't have the infrastructure to support any kind of outbreak. So, but yes, I used to say it sarcastically. Now, when I say it, I truly mean it, because I understand. I've done enough work of my own, plus worked with enough people now to understand that everyone is always doing the best that they can. Is it good enough? No, it's not good enough, but it's the best that they have with the tools. So I can say it today without sarcasm. And
I think that there comes some point anyway in our lives, and where we have to accept that was the past. If we're ever going to have any chance at all of getting on with here and now,
exactly,
we have to be able to say, well, that is what happened, but it isn't what's happening now. And because the unconscious doesn't have a sense of time, it's only our conscious mind that does. So we have to make that decision to sort of put in that time break. Otherwise, we're endlessly living in it. So it sounds like you've done that, you turned that corner, which is good for you. Was there any point at sort of that you remember in your childhood? I remember, because I grew up with an alcoholic father, and a sort of a mother who was mad because of it. So we were all insane as well because of it.
Mad or angry?
Sorry?
Mad or angry, because those words mean different things. Crazy. She was
in a real mess because of it. Sort of his violence and his drinking, and then having 5 kids and trying to feed when you've got a sixth kid who's apparently an adult and all that sort of stuff. So she was mad in that way.
Okay.
So quite understandably so, and mad angry as well, I think, because she'd grown up in a lot of violence, and so her father was an absolute nightmare. I'm sort of, I'm glad I don't have any memories of that guy. I don't want him in my head, to be honest. So glad I didn't see him very much. Yeah, in both senses, I think, and Irish republicanism.
Okay.
That was very strong in my family growing up, and so mad in that sense as well. Sort of very, very angry stuff going on and armed struggles. So in all senses of that word. But they did the best they could. And it wasn't great, but it was obviously it was all right because I'm here. And I'm just sort of recognizing that thing of, these angels, these people, these adults. There was a point, though, I remember a point when I realized that there was something weird about my family, which was when I went to a school friend's house and I accidentally broke something, and his parents didn't beat me up for it. And I remember thinking, they're weird. How strange. And then it was like, and they weren't, of course, weird and strange. They were just quite nice parents who were more concerned whether I'd hurt myself or not than anything else. And but I did think they were odd at the time. And that was when it began to occur to me that maybe my normal wasn't everybody's normal. Was there any of that in your childhood, any of those moments that you can remember?
Well, denial's an interesting thing, isn't it? My mom, I joking, again, I used to joke about it, but now I realize it's not a joke at all. My mom is the queen of denial, right? So if everything looks okay, then everything must be okay. And it's not that I didn't spend time at other people's homes. I did. And no, I never I never came home after school and found someone else's dad passed out on the floor with his pants around his ankles. Like that never happened at someone else's house. But there wasn't violence and that kind of stuff happening. And I did actually spend, and I don't even really know why. Now it's so weird when you said that. I started to think about how much time I did. I spent a lot of time in other kids' houses. Now I'm starting to wonder if my mom did that on purpose, because we had moved from the city up to a home about 45 minutes north of Toronto. And it was quite an ordeal to get to school from there, right? I had to drive with my mom and then take a bus and all this stuff. So I started to stay over at friends' homes quite a bit during the week during school. And this was in elementary school. So It's funny that I didn't. But now I'm actually concerned that I didn't notice that things weren't the same. But, by that point, my dad had already passed away. It was sort of those last couple of years of elementary school when I spent all that time at friends' homes. Yeah. But yeah, now you're making me wonder why I didn't. But I think that's it. The denial kicked in.
It's also, I think, people protect us as children. They protect us. And so they're not going to tell us, your mum and dad are shit. It's not the conversation that somebody has. What they do is they just see a troubled child and they pick them up and cuddle them and give them a nice time. And that's what you do with children, isn't it? If they seem slightly weird, which I'm sure I did without telling.
Sure, I did too.
I'm sure.
Thing that just this just recently has come up very prominently is this issue around anger. I would have told you when I went to treatment for my addiction in 2008. One of this kind of, I don't know if you use the same term, but beefcake kind of gym rat kind of big stocky guy. Yeah. One massive guy, and he looked at me one day. He's like, "You're really angry, eh?" And I said, "Sorry, that's a Canadian thing, eh?" Yeah. And I said, "What are you talking about?
What do you mean I'm angry? Don't be fucking stupid."
I wish it was like that, but the denial runs deep, right? It runs deep. It's taken me almost 13 years to get in touch with that anger. And I have told him, I'm still friends with that man is still in recovery too. And I've told him, I said, "You were right. I had no idea how much anger I had." And of course I would be angry. My needs weren't met. My needs were never even asked. Nobody asked me how I was. When I was doing the PTSD treatment a few weeks ago, one day, very early days, one of my first days there, one of the counselors said to me, when I was upset about something, she said, "Annie, are you okay?" First of all. And she said, looked at me and she said, what do you need right now? And I burst into tears. And it wasn't because I needed something that I knew I couldn't get or anything like that. It's because it was probably the first time in my entire life that I could remember when somebody actually asked me what I needed. And because I'm there, because we're talking about all this stuff, it took me back to my childhood, that nobody ever asked me how I was, what I needed, nothing. I raised myself. My mom left me alone for 2 weeks at 14 years of age. 14, she left me home alone for 2 weeks while she went to Newfoundland to visit her family. I mean, I have friends that literally, that their parents were just like, what? That was perfectly normal to her. Anyway.
And perfectly normal to you as well, which is the sad thing, isn't it? That as a child, you felt that this was okay. My needs don't matter. I'll sort them out. There is nobody that's going to come in, and that sort of self-sufficiency, which is inherently very damaging. I mean, it's profoundly damaging to the capacity to make relationships with other people, and making relationships with other people is what we need to do to survive in this life. So you discover sort of escapism and into drink and drugs at a relatively early age. It's a familiar story. And then is that when you decided to become a DJ? Is this when this part of the story comes in, or what happened?
I'll say two things, just because you mentioned the escapism. I learned escapism long before I found drinks and drugs. I smoked cigarettes. I ate candy, in a very, I would say, unhealthy, disordered way, as so many sour things until my tongue would be, raw, and books and music, anything to get me out, so I think I used those before I discovered the others. And the others I discovered, I think I had my first drink at 14. Soon after was, using marijuana and other things. I didn't really get into the drugs until the DJ thing, and that happened in my 20s. So I'll just sort of preamble the whole thing with, high school, whatever, barely graduated, still with high marks most of the time, but I attended less classes than and I never made it to university, which is such a shame. I did go back much later, but I just, what a waste, what a waste of a truly, I could have done anything. I could have done law, and that was my dream when I was a kid, and I did, nothing. And my choice in men from 14 to 33 until I met my future husband was just absolutely, ghastly choices. So I'll just skip over that and then say, so when I'm 23, I moved to Vancouver and I discovered this rave scene and these parties, and I discover my love of music, which I'd always had. My dad had a beautiful record collection. I loved music. My parents were always listening to jazz and classical, and I was introduced to so many incredible musicians through them. So I always had this love of music. I'd been buying records since I was 7 years old. And now I discovered that there was something that you could do with this. So I decided to pursue it, and it fell beautifully into place. And I was, within a couple of years, flying all over the world and traveling, and did that for about 10 years. And what a great way to hide out as an alcoholic. And just everybody loves to buy you drinks. You never have to pay for them. And so on went, a good, a solid 10 years of my life was spent just in a Groundhog Day type of, every weekend just looked the same, different venue, but intoxicated to extreme every weekend. And that was very much like my dad, right? My dad was not a daily drinker. He was a binge drinker. And that's how I drank.
Yeah.
Very rarely would I drink during the week or at work events and stuff. And we talked about the self-sufficiency. I was always so responsible. I didn't have a choice. My mom up and moved to Calgary, a city about maybe 3 hours from Toronto, where I was in my last year of high school. She just said, yeah, I'm going to go to Calgary. And I was like, well, I'm not leaving. I got, going to finish high school here with my friends. I'm not going to up and leave to Calgary. And she was like, okay. So we weren't even living in the same place. And now I'm on, on the other coast, but I always had a job. I always had to look after myself. There was no safety net. There was no, and so I became the opposite of most drug addict and alcoholic people that I know, because I always had to shut it down and go back to work on Monday morning. There was no, there was this weird, I want to say the weird amount of control. It's not really control. It's just some sort of, that thing in us that will to survive. I had no choice. I had to show up and do my job as well as.
It's interesting. I mean, I think you did have a choice, because there's always a choice there, isn't there? I don't mean to use or not use, not that one.
No.
So many people give up and just end up, in petty crime or on the streets, and that's where they go. But somehow you didn't. You stayed somehow connected to, well, I'm earning money, I've got a life, I'm going to do these things. And it resonates very strongly with me in the sense of, I went that route as well because of the poverty in my family, which was due to drink and all that sort of stuff. And there was no sense for me that there was somebody going to pick me up. And so I was the odd one out in my heavy drinking, using circle, in that I had a job. And other people didn't. They were sort of new age travelers who bummed around and did things. But that I never chose to do that. Do you know why you didn't go that route? Why you maintained the sort of career? For me, I mean, I think it sort of enabled my denial for much longer, which was the negative side of it. But there were some positive sides of it as well.
The only thing that occurs to me is what I already said, is just that I didn't feel like, I knew inherently that my mom had not done well financially. I guess my dad must have handled all that stuff, because she just didn't. And so
it's just, I guess it's just interesting. You didn't choose to become a bum, for example. That wasn't the route you chose. So, no. I mean, I thought about it. I once remember I was in Edinburgh and I was working, and I thought, I want to give up. I've had enough of this. And I saw a couple of street drinkers, and I thought very seriously about, well, do I want to do that? As I was watching one of them piss himself, and I was thinking, I wish I could do that. And I was thinking about it, but I chose not to for some reason. I don't know what it was, some sort of shred of self-esteem or something that sort of made.
Well, I think it goes back to what I said about my mom, though, is that, everything has to look good, right? And so this idea that I could possibly let myself not have the things, not like monetary, not so much, the biggest house or the this and that, but just I really, liked nice things, and I wanted to have nice things and look nice and have people think highly of me. I think that's actually probably a lot to do.
I get that. That makes sense. And it's often those things that that's where it turns, is on those types of things, and which you might think, your mum's vanity is a problem, but actually maybe it did save you in some really odd way.
I never thought of it as vanity. Actually, I thought of it as denial, because I understand now that my insides are what will dictate what I see on the outside of my life, as opposed to, for years, thought that it was the other way around, that as long as I managed everything well out here, then I would be okay in here.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I get that. I understand that. And I'm wondering also about the engagement with the arts. Again, that resonates very strongly, because my route was into the arts, into theatre and performance, live performance and so on. And I look back on that, and I think actually the fact that I was involved in something creative, even though it enabled my using, also was a saviour for me, without doubt, on a number of levels. One, they tolerated nutters, and I was a nutter, so it was fine. It was the tribe that could deal with me at the time. What was your experience? Was it something similar where you did you engage with the sort of music and the creativity as well?
Yeah, music was my only creative outlet. I've never really did. I had lots of friends who went into film and worked in that industry. I never went that route, but I've had friends say to me that if there was ever anyone who was going to walk in and just nail the starring role in any particular movie, it would be me. And I'm not sure what that compliment really means, but this is from someone who is a professional actor, so it must mean something. But yes, music was my creative outlet. I had absolutely Now, again, we talked about it as escapism when I was really young, you know, like hiding out in my room and just listening to music for hours was part of the escapism. And it definitely, when it was in those nightclubs and in that environment, there was a certain level of escapism to it. But I think the bigger piece is that seeking of something, of a connection to something. Yeah. And there were moments, I always would talk about these afterwards, where I wouldn't even remember what I played. And there's a particular song that I still love very much, where it speaks, it's probably from an old jazz record, but he talks about improvising wildly. And DJing is there's a very specific formula to it in a way, because music is, you know, a certain number of bars, and that changes in house music every 16 or 32 bars. Like there's ways that it's formulaic, but I never played that way. I always instinctively put things together the way I wanted to put them together, and really, really connected with that idea of improvising wildly. So music was a way to connect. I loved being able to get that automatic, not the validation. I really mean this when I say it was not false pride. I wasn't pretending. I actually had a very hard time receiving the adoration if people were clapping or cheering or doing those things. It wasn't why I was there. I just wanted everyone to have fun. I just wanted everyone to have a good time. And my mom's favorite expression is, "Aren't we having a grand time?" That's a newfie thing to say. And it was like, that was really, you know, my parents were entertainers. I love to entertain. I love to connect with people and meet people. And I did. I mean, I have friends all over the world because of that part of my life. So there's a lot to the music, and I'm doing it again during the quarantine. I put my turntables out. I did a live stream almost every day, and it brought so much joy to people, including me. And it was the best. So I'm grateful. Music saved me. Music saved me. Absolutely.
My boy Matteo is a aspiring DJ, and we bought him some decks for his 10th birthday, and sort of
10.
Yeah. He's absolutely over the moon with them, and he gets his Mac out and he starts sort of getting his music. He's a great choice of music. I've got some of his Spotify sort of things that are sort of great to listen to. So I mean, it's great stuff. I mean, I think I'm really interested in that sort of thing about the arts and subcultures, and how it can support people, keep people alive. I genuinely think that sort of my involvement in the arts sort of did keep me alive. So very depressed period of time in my life when I was very, very low and sort of really quite suicidal, and you were sort of you were becoming successful, but it was hollow because, like you say, you couldn't receive it, and you were desperately trying to connect. I understand that, and not succeeding, except in a sort of very prescribed way. You certainly weren't connecting with other humans by the sounds of it, and it sounds like it was quite lonely in some ways.
Yeah, because the end of the night, and that was you've done it a few times now, where you've made me think about things that I haven't really either in a long time or ever thought of. But yeah, the end of the party was always hard for me. I don't like endings. I don't know if that's about my dad's death. I don't know if that's about adoption, rejection. I don't know, but I don't like endings. And so the end of the party would be coming, and I'd be trying to carry it on back to my house, which sounds like it was about the drinking or even the drugs, but it wasn't. It was just not wanting to be home alone.
Yeah.
You know, the ending.
You really were alone when you were home.
Always.
And some people understand what to be alone feels like, and some people don't. But it's particularly, I think, those kids that are brought up with significant attachment disorders, which you clearly were. There can be something very, very frightening about being on your own, because you don't develop those sort of internal processes that other children with secure attachments naturally develop. You know, the continuity of self, that experience of the continuity of self is a very difficult thing. So it can be very frightening being on your own. So I get it. I understand that. And you were doing this desperate. I guess the story is that it gets worse and worse, the using.
You know, really, I always say this. They don't. Most people, like when I got to the treatment center, we had to do a graph of our drinking and using, sort of from, where it started and then, to where it was. And mine just went straight up, straight across and down, done. Like there was no attempts at quitting. There was no attempts at stopping or slowing down, because no one in my life, including, when I met my husband in 2003, I was 33. And he said to me, I don't care if you drink, I love drinking. It's great fun. But if you're like drugs, it's a deal breaker for me. And I won't put up with it. And I said, well, no problem. I got to stop this nonsense anyway. Thought for sure that it would be no problem to just put that part down, but it was not. And I won't go too far out that way, but that's, other than him saying that to me at that one point, there was no real attempt on my part ever to slow down or stop my drinking or my drugging. It just went straight to the level it went to, and it stayed that way the entire time. And then one morning in 2008, I woke up and realized it felt like the kind of a burning bush kind of moment. It was just, I had maybe had one or two conversations before that with a counselor about my life and all the things that were wrong with it. And he, at the end of it, said, well, have you ever considered, Annie, that you might be an alcoholic? And I just looked at him like he had, 6 eyes and 2 foreheads and a green nose. Like, no, I'd literally never thought that once, not once in my life. So there was no ups and downs. There were no.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. It is. I mean, looking back on this thing, it is hilarious, isn't it? This idea that you didn't know the person who was clinging it so heavily had never occurred to you. Oh, I got a problem with this.
No. It's once. And that's the best part. Like, denial is so strong, right? It's not even funny. And I mean, I learned from the best. I don't want to throw my mom under the bus. She really is a beautiful woman with a very troubled, obviously intergenerational trauma in her history and all kinds of alcoholism. I'm the first person in 9 generations of her family ever. No one's ever gotten sober. No one. So deeply rooted. But, I could sit there with, something in black and white and show it to my mom's face, and she will go, I don't know what you're talking about, and believe it and mean it with every ounce of her. So it's a very, I've had to work very, very, very hard to tear down these walls. And it came up again, 8 years into my recovery. I had no idea I was anxious. I'd always been anxious. How would I know I was anxious? I was like a fish in water. What's water? I had no idea. And then I got diagnosed with complex PTSD because I had never dealt with any of these things that were creating all this anxiety. So it was not just the alcoholism that I didn't know about. There are many, it's like there's many, I'm sure there's more. More will be revealed. 13 years in my 13th year of recovery now, I'm still discovering things that I had no idea were my reality.
But in a sense, that's a healthy life, isn't it? Discovering things. But my sense of using was to avoid any knowledge whatsoever. There was nothing was going to come in, and it was great because I could just reset the day every day. That was it. So start again, reset, press the reset button. There was no experience, no learning, no wisdom, no insights. Nothing would happen. So it just sort of. But you described this thing, and I've heard it before. And it's quite a common thing. It may be unusual to people who are listening, but there was just a moment you woke up and you knew that was it, right?
Literally.
And it was done. You were done. You were finished. And then you go to a rehab. Why did you go to a rehab? What was the sort of motivation there?
Well, I think this is so, this is a good jumping off part to stop talking about the problem, get into the solution. But one of the things I find very fascinating is how people enter recovery and what services they access, what route they take, what modality. It all depends on who they talk to. Did they talk to their family doctor? Did they talk to another person who's in recovery? Did they talk to a counselor? All these different things, because the way that it worked for me was when I came to, and it was not a wake up, it was a come to. It was my very first aware of a blackout. Now, that does not mean I didn't black out before that day. It just means that was the first time that I woke up and came to and actually knew by looking around and not knowing where I was that something had happened to me, that I had lost time, and then it was a desperate, frantic, what happened, and trying to piece things together, and people telling me things and me not believing them, and then being shown the proof. And then it was I don't, I say to people who are new in recovery, or if I'm telling my story, I always say, I hang on to that feeling, and not in a way to beat myself up, not in a way to make myself feel shame or guilt or remorse or anything negative, but because I don't ever want to forget how terrible and terrifying and just soul crushing that moment really was. That the person I thought I was here, and the person I had become was here. It was just such a moment. And so I hang on to that feeling because I don't ever want to feel that again. I don't ever want to go back to that again. But it did. And that person who came to my house that day, the only other sober woman that I knew in the world, I had lunch plans with that day. Like, that's not a coincidence, right? So I phoned that woman at 7:30 in the morning and said, "Can we have lunch now, please?" And she came to my house, and we made the arrangements for me to go to rehab. Why? Because she had gone to rehab. Did I know I needed rehab? Did I even try to quit on my own? Nope. Just, what did they say in that Monopoly game? Go straight to
jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200, etc., etc.
Straight to rehab. And you know what? It was the greatest gift. I really believe that anyone who can stop their life for long enough to take that gift. I'm not saying everybody needs rehab, but it was a gift in my world, absolutely, because I needed to really understand what my background, my history, all the different components. It wasn't just, did I need to understand alcoholism? No, I needed to understand, the big picture of my life, and be able to stop. And that's the other thing. My favorite drug, to be honest with you, is busy, right? That's the one that really kept me from being able to look at myself in any real way for the longest time. It was busy. And so to stop and really pay attention and be present in my life for that 5 weeks that I was there was a gift. And I ended up going back and working there and doing communications and marketing for them for a few years. And from there got into advocacy work, and, everything went from that. So I know that it all happened really very,
Can you remember those early days of sobriety in there? I remember because I went in, I had a medical detox. I wouldn't have survived otherwise. And I would, little warning here for people: don't just stop, do get advice. It's particularly alcohol is quite a dangerous drug to suddenly stop. So if you're thinking of stopping, you're getting sort of triggers around this, identifying with the story. And that's the reason why I've asked Annie to talk so comprehensively about it. So you can, I think it's in our stories that we understand, oh, I'm like that. Oh, maybe I've got the same problem. And that's a really helpful thing. So thank you, Annie, for being so sort of open with us. And if you are feeling that, we'll put up numbers for you, such as AA, the NHS sort of services that exist. So my team will put those out. But don't just stop if you're drinking heavily. Talk to your doctor, talk to a medic first, and you sort of need to. And that's a segue into, I was going to say that because I had to have a medical detox, otherwise I'd have sort of I was in the nurse's station. So, and I remember day 3, as I came off the meds, and I was lucky. I don't know what your experience was, but I was lucky that I was early in the morning. It was a very beautiful winter's morning. There was frost and ice on the tree limbs, and there was a beautiful sunrise, and there was this beautiful pink, red, multicolored red, yellow, orange fire in the sky, which then went on all the branches of the trees, and all the ice caught it and magnified it. That was just one of the best ways of waking up to sobriety. And I was immediately in touch with something that I think I'd been trying to get hold of through my creativity all the time, which was this sense of beauty and awe. And I had that immediately, and I was very grateful for that. And I sort of didn't look back, so it's been very easy for me, because if that's the introduction to a sober life, it's not too bad, right? What was yours like? Do you remember how it was for you?
I do. So I had not been drinking daily, etc. So I was able, when I made that decision, when I got up that day that I was done, I didn't go to treatment for a few days, and it never even occurred to me to take another drink or to tie one last one on, or, not even, take the edge off, like nothing. I sat in a house full of booze with no one home with me, and I just waited until it was time to go. I went to an AA meeting with that female friend of mine, Georgia, on the Saturday night. But my first few days in the treatment center were magical, because it was on an island here off the coast of Vancouver. Beautiful scenery, beautiful, little animals, little critters running around. And the two things that I remember most were this notion of, because right away they're talking about the 12 steps, and they're talking about God, and I had been raised Catholic and had been, very adamantly away from that for a long time. Nothing against it, just wasn't for me. And when they started to talk about, this step 2, and could you possibly, believe in something? And here I am looking out these beautiful windows, and exactly what you said, the beauty and the awe of what I'm witnessing. It was so easy for me to realize that I'm not in control of this world. I'm not in control. I can't make a tree. I don't know how to make a deer or a bunny rabbit or any other little creature. No human that I know can make those things. And so it was a very easy for me to transition into, and I'm not saying I didn't immediately, turned my will and my life over and did everything magically after that. No, but it was a beautiful ability for me to see it in a very palpable way, like what was going on, and that I wasn't in charge or making those things. And the other thing I remember that was so beautiful was all of my needs were met. These weird little things would happen. I was in the gym, I'd forgotten my hair tie, and I looked down and there's a hair tie sitting there. It was like, they were silly, they were little, but I believe that the universe, God, creator, whatever people call it, doesn't matter. Whatever that force is that's out there, that's helping us, when it shows you things in a way that means something to you. For me, it's always been numbers and music and little things, but those little signs I had that I was gonna, were just enough for me to know, like, I was on the right path and I was going to be okay. And that's continued to happen, little signs along the way that I am where I'm supposed to be. And if I just pay attention, I see those things still today.
And so at that point, you do your program, you go back home. What was the next steps in terms of the recovery for you? And there's a sort of journey then?
I followed along in 12-step for quite some time. I went to meetings a lot. My husband and I didn't stay together. He didn't support my decision to go to the treatment center or get sober. So year 1 was pretty rough, went through a divorce, and decided fairly early on that the stressful project management in IT job that I had held for 8 years at Dell was not really working for me either. It's something that fed into that busy, life, and I didn't want to do that anymore. So when I was offered the opportunity to come work at the treatment center, I did that. Throughout these last 13 years, I mean, again, I'm not sure what your listeners are used to hearing, but I've tried everything. I have literally done ayahuasca ceremonies. I've done one. I've done, EMDR. I've done havening. I've done a lot of different modalities to try to help heal the trauma, because I really do believe that the trauma is at the heart of what was making me drink and use and be in the terrible relationships that I was in all those years. And I continue on that journey today. I don't prescribe or tell people what they should do. I believe that each of us has a recovery journey to take, and the advocacy work that I did early on in my own journey allowed me to see that just because I had done a particular modality didn't mean that that was the only modality or that it was going to work for anyone else. And this idea that we're all unique is true. And so what works for one person isn't what's going to work for another person. And that's just what I believe.
Never giving up, just keeping on working on it.
Active. Yeah. As long as you're actively working at your recovery. Yeah.
So you've introduced the big T word. Let's talk about that then. What does trauma mean in terms of for you and your experience of it, and sort of what you've done in terms of helping yourself with it? So what do you mean by trauma?
Well, I think for the sake of our wonderful listeners, I define trauma not as the events themselves that I went through, because those events could have been gone through by a different person and interpreted and processed differently. I consider trauma to be my own personal body, physical, mental, all the ways, responses to the things that happened to me, like adoption, like my dad's death. I was in a really bad car accident when I was 20 and almost died. I witnessed that murder when I was 29. You know, lots of it's just crazy things in relationships. So there was a number of quite big T traumas that you know, on the ACEs score would, you know, had me pretty high on that number. And again, because of the denial, because of the, you know, I can't talk to my mom about some of the things that happened to me when I was a child. When I try to talk to her about it, she just shuts me down and tells me that that didn't happen. And so I've had to, again, let that go. Understand.
Are you okay, Annie, talking about this?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you asked that, because it's actually good, because you pulled me back into me, because what generally happens is I dissociate, right? Is I start talking.
I was wondering, I thought you glazed over a little bit, so I thought I better just check that you're okay. And for people who don't know what dissociation is, it's a very creative thing that we learn how not to feel stuff when those feelings become too difficult to feel. So it's a real grace, but it can get in the way of everyday living. It's the problem. It's sort of when you don't need to do it anymore, it just becomes a bit of a pain. So, but give yourself a moment to ground, and we've got plenty of time. I mean, I always think, I don't know what you think, sort of from your experience, that there's a big crossover as well between sort of trauma responses is probably the better way of saying it. And I agree with you that that's what we're talking about. And also things like attachment disorder from early abandonment in childhood, and sort of parental failure, environmental, let's call it environmental failure. It's slightly more clinical language, and maybe will reduce the sense of disassociating. So environmental failure can be experienced traumatically, and trauma symptoms. But for people who don't know, I'm going to maybe rabbit on about what trauma symptoms seem like. We just had one, which is called dissociation, which is that sort of thing that our body can do to take over and protect us if feelings become a bit too overwhelming. And particularly happens in complex trauma that starts in childhood as well, in particular, because it's often the only defense mechanism a child has, is to sort of retreat from the felt experience. And so that's what they do, because children freeze as opposed to fight and flight. I mean, that frozen state, dissociation, becomes flashbacks. I presume you've had those. You understand what those are. Actually, substance misuse and alcoholism are symptoms of trauma as well on the diagnostic criteria. If you look at them, they, you know, oh, tick, 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 got that. Anxiety, depression, inability to see a hopeful future. In fact, a foreshortening of the future. So that you don't see a future at all in many ways. Avoidance is a classic one. I can't think about that. I don't want to go to that place. It reminds me of stuff. All of these seem familiar to you, Annie, these types of symptoms you had. I should imagine all of them to varying degrees at some point. And you can imagine, you know, if you're listening, that if you've got this complex of experiences and symptoms, that doing everyday life is a bit of a chore. What worked for you to get you into back into? So you stopped the using, which was really courageous, and well done you. Pat on the back for that. And 13 years is really awesome as well. It's fantastic achievement. What sort of other things have you done that you found really useful in terms of dealing with these trauma responses in your body?
So in the early days, well, first of all, I was always a practitioner of yoga, and I thought, it was quite funny. I'm a yoga teacher now. I have been since 2005, but when I first got my yoga teacher training, I wasn't sober. And I look back on it now, I actually showed up for that exam after that teacher training. Like, I was so hungover that I had to lie on my yoga mat and write out my exam. Anyways, again, something else to think about. So yoga was huge, right? Yoga was huge getting me into my body, but it wasn't enough because it was still way too easy for me to scurry back up to the safety of this lovely brain of mine. Meditation, huge piece. A PTSD therapist eventually, like a trauma psychologist who specializes in PTSD and trauma. I started seeing her about 7 years ago. And then I did an outpatient program that involved a lot of different modalities, somatic experiencing, and that really, I think, has been the key, is to start to get at it in my body, because again, I can tell you all the things that I tell you about my life. I can talk about them, and I'll do exactly what I've always done, which is just talk about it and not feel it. So this latest experience that I had at the wellness center here on Vancouver Island for 6 weeks was just recently there. We dove into my trauma in a different way, but also in a felt body experience. It's called IDSTP. Have you heard of it?
Don't tell me about it. I don't know.
Intensive, dynamic, short-term psychotherapy. Like somatic experiencing, though, doesn't get into a lot of the story about what you went through, but just what's going on in your body right now. Fantastic. And that's when I was able to access the anger, because, you know, my dad was an alcoholic, and also well, I'll just say that he was at least inappropriate, and I don't have the memories if there's more, but certainly signs that there may have been. And to try to deal with, you know, again, a small young, I had no tools. So it's amazing to me that the anger that I have been able to now access, it's actually quite rageful. And I think this way of dealing with it through EMDR and through somatic experiencing and a lot of different modalities have worked. I'm not sure exactly what the perfect magic thing was. I just know that my willingness to keep healing is the theme, right? It's like my friends are always just amazed. Like, you're still going to go get more help. Yes, I'm still going to go get more help because I have.
But that's really important, I think, because you're not alone in having had some dreadful things happen to you in your life, and virtually all the sort of addicts that we treat have had dreadful things happen to them, and everybody needs some hope that it is going to be okay and that it can be okay. And in many ways, what you're evidence of is that hope, you know. And hope for me isn't that I can see the light. Hope for me is I can see what the next step is.
Yes.
You know, and helping people to make that next step is the really hopeful thing to do, not what the end game is. And in many ways, giving up on the end game is really important. And all of this you bring into this recovery advocacy that you do, all of that, this life experience that you're courageous enough to face and willing enough to admit that you're vulnerable and weak and you need help, and all those things that you wouldn't have done to save your life when you're a kid, but you now will do, is what you bring into. I was looking at your website; it's not quite developed yet. So tell us what your plans are now that you've done the healing. You're obviously going to take a bit of time to continue that healing process. But what are the plans for you now going forwards, do you think?
So a few things. So I mean, I'm going to continue on as a yoga teacher and a recovery coach and an advocate. Those will always be things that I do, and I you know, I do quite a number of, you know, conferences and speaking, et cetera, along those lines. So I think I'll always do those things. But a friend of mine in Toronto and I are actually launching a new company called Silverline. The pandemic certainly showed us that, you know, although there were many, many tragic things, and I think, you know, any one of us that is in recovery are, you know, we are the story of it being a silver lining. Recovery is the silver lining of addiction. And recovery is the silver lining of trauma, you know, these ideas. So I'd like to say in the next 6 months, we'll have, you know, more of a presence both in social media and with a website. But I do believe that giving back and being of service in a different way, I just want to maybe pivot it a little bit, because having been through as much trauma as I have, and then working with people who are traumatized as a coach can also be, it can be quite heavy. So I think finding a way to be of service still to people who are in recovery, but without it being a direct one-on-one relationship is where I'd like to take things in the future.
Great. Well, I look forward to that. I mean, it's just going to be an amazing. I'm really inspired by the sort of positive attitude that you take, and it's not a toxic positivity. It's very much one that's rooted on, you know, shitty things happen and they're shitty. There's no avoiding that, but it's what can we learn from that? What can we grow out of from that, rather than just stay in it? But, you know, how can I transform this experience for myself? And you seem to really sort of embody that. And also, I think, yeah, I'm really struck by your honesty about, you know, this pandemic is hurting me. I need help. That's, for me, if there's anything I can teach people, it's help-seeking behaviour. That will get you everywhere, I think. I remember when I was a social services manager working with kids who are at risk, that's the only thing we really could get, the only message we could get across to them is, you know, something feels uncomfortable, go and ask somebody for help with it. But it's funny when, you know, that thing about the fish in the water, if the water's as uncomfortable as you just don't know. So something has to give, and hopefully that comes along. We are at the end, unfortunately, Annie. I know it goes really quick, doesn't it? It's like, I remember you thinking, oh, an hour. I can't do a whole hour, but it's easy enough to do. It's been really wonderful to have you on. And I really celebrate your courage and your honesty and your journey as well. It's really inspiring stuff, Annie. And I wish you, you know, all the best.
Thank you. I love what you said. I think the magic words that we all will, you know, we need to be able to say and continue to say for our entire lives when we need it is, I need help. Those three magic words will never serve us badly, I think. Yeah, so absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Noel. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful to have you on. I think you'll agree. It's been a fantastic show. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we are here next week. And yet again, I can't remember who's on, but there you go. The advertising will go out, and it'd be lovely to see you all join us again. So for this evening, good night.
Good night.